The foundations of the Hundred Years' War were laid centuries before 1337, rooted in the complex web of feudal obligations and territorial holdings that defined medieval Europe. Following the Norman conquest of 1066, English kings acquired extensive lands in France, beginning a paradoxical relationship in which a monarch was simultaneously a sovereign ruler and a vassal to another king. The Angevin Empire, established under Henry II, extended across Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine, creating a patchwork of authority that placed English rulers in frequent tension with the French crown. Over successive generations, the empire expanded and contracted, influenced by dynastic marriages, feudal conflicts, and military campaigns, ultimately leaving England with the Duchy of Gascony by the early 14th century. This arrangement required English kings to perform homage to their French overlords, a formal acknowledgement that generated both ceremonial and legal friction. French monarchs, particularly Philip II and his Capetian successors, increasingly asserted control over vassals and territories, challenging the quasi-independent position of English holdings. Disputes over taxation, feudal obligations, and judicial authority further strained relations. By examining the interplay of dual monarchies, vassalage, and legal frameworks, it becomes clear that the structural contradictions of medieval governance created a scenario in which open conflict was almost inevitable. These feudal tensions set the stage for the subsequent crisis over royal succession, transforming legal and ceremonial disputes into a catalyst for prolonged war. The death of Charles IV in 1328, leaving no male heir, triggered a dynastic crisis that directly contributed to the outbreak of war. France faced a profound question: who could lawfully inherit the throne in accordance with prevailing laws and customs? The French nobility endorsed Philip of Valois, a cousin of the deceased king, citing the Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line. This decision deliberately excluded Edward III of England, whose claim derived from his mother, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV. Edward's initial acceptance of Philip VI's kingship, accompanied by formal homage for his continental holdings, reflected temporary compliance, but this accommodation quickly deteriorated as political, economic, and territorial disputes intensified. Legal arguments regarding Salic law were as much tools of political strategy as they were expressions of legal principle, providing the Valois monarchy with legitimacy in the eyes of French lords while simultaneously undermining English claims. The succession dispute thus moved beyond a technical interpretation of inheritance law to encompass national identity, dynastic authority, and the control of vital economic territories such as Gascony. By the mid-1330s, unresolved succession questions, coupled with entrenched feudal tensions, created an environment in which diplomacy could no longer forestall hostilities, laying the groundwork for the first phases of the Hundred Years' War. These interlocking feudal and dynastic factors illustrate how structural contradictions in medieval politics, dual allegiances, territorial fragmentation, and contested succession prepared both kingdoms for a prolonged period of conflict, setting the trajectory that would dominate Western Europe for over a century. Economic considerations played a decisive role in the escalation of tensions between England and France, adding a critical layer to the already complex feudal and dynastic disputes. During the early 14th century, England's wool exports were essential to the cloth-producing regions of Flanders, a territory formerly under French suzerainty, yet economically dependent on the steady supply of raw wool from England. The prosperity of Flemish towns such as Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres relied on uninterrupted trade, and any disruption in English exports posed immediate threats to local economies and social stability. Recognizing this interdependence, Philip VI attempted to assert stronger royal control over Flemish towns, seeking to redirect economic and political loyalty toward the French crown. In response, England leveraged the strategic importance of its wool trade as a tool of influence, instituting embargoes or threatening restrictions to pressure Philip's government and support anti-French factions within Flanders. Edward III capitalized on these conditions to build continental alliances, appealing to Flemish merchants and urban elites who feared French economic domination. By intertwining commerce with diplomacy, England transformed trade networks into instruments of political leverage, demonstrating how economic interdependence could directly shape international relations. These developments not only heightened friction but also encouraged Edward III's government to view confrontation as increasingly unavoidable, illustrating how economic warfare often presages armed conflict. The strategic alignment of England with Flemish interests and the growing polarization of trade loyalties foreshadowed the transition from diplomatic maneuvering to formal claims of sovereignty. By 1337, the mounting pressures of dynastic dispute, feudal obligation, and economic tension culminated in Edward III's formal declaration of his claim to the French crown. This declaration was both a legal assertion, rooted in his maternal descent from Philip IV, and a strategic maneuver intended to consolidate domestic support, legitimize military mobilization, and strengthen alliances abroad. Within England, Edward faced considerable pressure from the nobility, who sought opportunities for territorial expansion, economic advantage, and prestige, while fiscal constraints demanded new sources of revenue that could be justified through military action. Edward's advisors recognized that asserting a claim offered a unifying narrative to legitimize taxation and levies necessary to support a continental campaign. Philip VI's response, most notably the confiscation of the Duchy of Aquitaine, escalated tensions by directly threatening English territorial and economic interests in France. Initial military preparations followed, with both sides engaging in diplomacy, securing allies, and issuing formal statements to justify their positions. Propaganda circulated in England emphasized the defense of traditional rights and feudal entitlements, while France framed Edward's claim as an illegitimate challenge to sovereign authority. This combination of legal, political, and economic pressures created the conditions for war. Edward's declaration was not a sudden or impulsive act. Rather, it represented the culmination of decades of structural conflict, reflecting the intertwined pressures of dynastic ambition, territorial dispute, and economic strategy. With formal claims now asserted and diplomatic options exhausted, Europe entered a phase in which naval engagements, sieges, and land campaigns would define the early years of the Hundred Years' War, setting the trajectory for over a century of intermittent but persistent warfare. The opening phase of the Hundred Years' War was as much a contest for control of the seas as it was a struggle over land. Edward III recognized early that England's ability to project military power onto the continent depended on secure maritime supply lines, particularly across the English Channel. In 1340, Philip VI assembled a substantial fleet at Sluis, drawing vessels and crews from Norman, Picard, and Genoese sources, aiming to cut England off from reinforcing its forces in Flanders and northern France. Edward responded with a fleet departing from the Thames, composed primarily of well-armed merchant vessels retrofitted for war. At Sluis, the French employed a defensive strategy by chaining their ships together, intending to create an anchored line that could withstand boarding. Edward's forces countered this formation by concentrating longbowmen on deck, raining volleys of arrows to suppress French sailors, while specialized boarding parties crossed onto enemy vessels to engage in close combat. The result was catastrophic for France. Nearly the entire fleet was destroyed or captured, granting England command of the Channel for decades. This victory allowed Edward to maintain uninterrupted troop movements, transport supplies, and coordinate campaigns without substantial maritime threat, fundamentally shaping the operational possibilities for subsequent land offensives. Control of the Channel also provided leverage in diplomatic negotiations and regional alliances, reinforcing England's strategic position. By neutralizing French naval power, Edward ensured that England's continental ambitions were not constrained by supply vulnerabilities, demonstrating the critical link between maritime dominance and successful military projection. The outcome at Sluis established a precedent for integrating naval capability into combined military strategy, laying the groundwork for England's subsequent campaigns across northern France and the Low Countries. Following initial successes at sea, Edward III focused on forging continental alliances to exert pressure on France across multiple fronts. England relied heavily on support from the Low Countries, including Flemish towns with vested economic interests. as well as potential allies within the Holy Roman Empire and German principalities. Maintaining these alliances required substantial subsidies, financial incentives, and diplomatic negotiation, highlighting the costly and complex nature of coalition warfare. Between 1339 and 1342, English forces conducted a series of chevauchées, mobile raids intended to devastate French territories, damage morale, and disrupt economic infrastructure. Despite mobilizing large numbers of troops, these operations yielded limited permanent territorial gains due to logistical challenges, coordinated French defensive responses, and the difficulties of sustaining Allied commitments over extended campaigns. These early land operations revealed the strategic potential of multinational coalitions, demonstrating how Edward could marshal forces far beyond England's borders, while simultaneously illustrating the inherent constraints of such alliances. Diplomatic networks provided operational depth, but did not automatically translate into decisive battlefield victories. Edward's reliance on Allied contingents required careful negotiation, timing, and resource management, underscoring the intricate relationship between political maneuvering and military action. Although the campaigns did not produce large-scale conquest, they tested the limits of coalition strategy and established patterns of cross-border coordination that would recur throughout the war. The successes and setbacks of this period highlighted both the opportunities and challenges of integrating diplomacy with military planning, setting the stage for more direct offensives in Western France as England sought clear and decisive outcomes. The Breton War of Succession illustrates how regional disputes could expand into larger continental conflicts, entangling both England and France in a protracted struggle. When Duke John III of Brittany died in 1341 without a direct heir, rival claims emerged. Charles of Blois, supported by France, and John of Montfort, supported by England. The dispute quickly escalated from a local dynastic question into a military theater that demanded considerable resources and attention from both kingdoms. Key engagements included the sieges of Hennebont and Brest, where defenders employed fortifications and local knowledge to resist besieging forces, demonstrating the role of regional actors in shaping outcomes. Notably, Jean de Flandre actively defended Montfort's cause, exemplifying the agency of noble women in wartime leadership. English involvement forced France to divide attention between Brittany and other strategic fronts, contributing to overextension and exposing vulnerabilities along northern and western approaches. The conflict in Brittany highlights the interconnected nature of medieval politics, where a seemingly localized succession dispute could influence alliance dynamics, operational planning, and resource allocation across kingdoms. The war remained unresolved for years, creating a persistent zone of tension that reinforced mutual distrust and solidified Anglo-French enmity. By drawing both powers into sustained military operations, the Breton crisis served as an early example of proxy conflict, foreshadowing patterns that would recur throughout the Hundred Years' War. The situation underscored how political disputes in peripheral regions could escalate into broader campaigns, shaping strategic calculations across multiple theaters. In 1346, Edward III launched a major campaign into Normandy, marking a turning point in English operational strategy. Landing near Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue, his forces advanced rapidly, combining speed with targeted economic disruption to maximize strategic effect. The campaign emphasized mobility, use of longbowmen, and careful selection of objectives, reflecting lessons learned from earlier coalition operations and naval dominance. The siege and subsequent sack of Caen in July 1346 illustrated both tactical efficiency and strategic intent. The city was a key commercial hub and a symbol of French authority, and its capture sent a clear signal of English capability and resolve. Logistical planning was critical, with supply lines coordinated to support rapid troop movement and maintain operational tempo. Philip VI pursued Edward's forces to prevent junction with allied Flemish contingents, creating a complex interplay of maneuver and countermaneuver across northern France. These movements culminated in the approach to the Battle of Crécy, where converging forces would test battlefield discipline, the integration of archery with infantry, and the evolving tactical doctrines that would define the war. The 1346 campaign demonstrated England's growing proficiency in combining strategic mobility, economic disruption, and targeted military objectives, establishing a pattern for subsequent operations and setting the conditions for one of the most decisive confrontations of the Hundred Years' War. This approach also highlighted the increasing importance of operational coordination and pre-planned movement, bridging early raids and coalition campaigns with full-scale continental invasion. On August 26, 1346, Edward III's forces confronted a numerically superior French army near Crécy and Ponthieu, establishing a defensive position that leveraged both terrain and disciplined troop formations. The English deployed longbowmen on elevated ground, supported by dismounted men-at-arms arranged in tight, cohesive units, a departure from the traditionally aggressive cavalry charges of medieval warfare. The French army, commanded by Philip VI, included heavy cavalry, levied infantry, and Genoese crossbowmen, creating a formidable but unwieldy force. Repeated French charges were disrupted by sustained longbow volleys, which inflicted casualties before combatants could close with the English line. Rain dampened crossbow strings, further reducing the effectiveness of Genoese contingents, while French command suffered from poor coordination among various contingents and regional levies. The combination of Edward's tactical foresight, terrain exploitation, and disciplined infantry firepower resulted in a decisive English victory, reshaping contemporary understanding of battlefield effectiveness. Crécy demonstrated that well-trained ranged units could counter traditional cavalry dominance, signaling a shift toward combined arms tactics that emphasized infantry, archery, and coordination over reliance on mounted knights alone. The battle set the stage for further English advances, establishing a model of defensive strategy that would influence subsequent campaigns in northern France. By achieving a clear operational advantage through careful planning and effective use of available technology, Edward III consolidated English momentum and created conditions for strategic initiatives such as the forthcoming siege of Calais. Following the victory at Crécy, Edward III moved northward to lay siege to Calais, a fortified port essential for French coastal defense and European trade networks. The English constructed extensive siege works, including earthworks, ditches, and fortified encampments, while naval forces established blockades to prevent the delivery of supplies and reinforcements. The city endured a prolonged siege of nearly 12 months, during which famine, disease, and declining morale affected both the civilian population and defending garrison. Despite the hardship, defenders maintained resistance, necessitating careful coordination of English operations to sustain the siege without overextending supply lines. In August 1347, Calais capitulated, resulting in England's acquisition of a permanent continental base. This position offered secure harbor facilities, enabling resupply of troops, staging of subsequent campaigns, and control over key maritime trade routes. The siege demonstrated the English ability to integrate naval supremacy with land-based siegecraft, establishing a model for future operations where combined arms and sustained logistics proved decisive. Calais remained strategically critical for 2 centuries, illustrating how the capture of a single port could anchor a broader military and diplomatic posture. By consolidating control over Calais, England secured both a physical foothold and a symbolic representation of operational competence, providing a platform for further influence in southwestern France under leaders such as the Black Prince. Edward, the Black Prince, emerged as a central figure in consolidating English authority in Aquitaine following the capture of Calais and earlier victories. Tasked with both administrative oversight and military defense, he navigated a complex political landscape in which local Gascon nobles maintained loyalties divided between England and France. His responsibilities included managing fiscal obligations, maintaining loyalty through grants and appointments, and negotiating with local elites to ensure stability. Concurrently, he led offensive operations designed to disrupt French authority and extract economic concessions, employing rapid chevauchées across Languedoc that targeted towns, agricultural centers, and communication routes. These raids devastated French revenue bases while demonstrating the efficacy of highly mobile, coordinated forces under experienced command. The Black Prince's leadership style combined personal valor with disciplined planning, reinforcing English credibility and deterring regional uprisings. His dual role as administrator and commander illustrated the interplay between governance and military action, revealing that effective occupation required both coercion and negotiation. By undermining French control and consolidating English influence in Aquitaine, the Black Prince enhanced England's strategic flexibility, setting the stage for decisive confrontations such as the Battle of Poitiers and establishing a template for the integration of civil and military authority in contested regions. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, marked a watershed in the Hundred Years' War, demonstrating the culmination of English tactical evolution and operational foresight. The Black Prince positioned his forces defensively near Maupertuis, employing hedgerows and natural terrain features to constrain French cavalry movements and create choke points for advancing infantry. King John II's army, composed of heavily armored knights, infantry levies, and allied contingents, launched repeated assaults against the prepared English line. Sustained longbow fire inflicted heavy casualties, while disciplined counterattacks exploited gaps and maintained cohesion under pressure. The engagement ended with the capture of King John II and numerous high-ranking nobles, generating a political crisis that undermined French monarchical authority and disrupted the organization of feudal levies. The consequences extended beyond immediate battlefield results. France faced internal instability, fiscal strain, and challenges in negotiating ransoms, while England gained leverage in both diplomacy and territorial influence. Poitiers exemplified the effectiveness of combined defensive tactics, terrain exploitation, and coordinated use of ranged units, reinforcing lessons established at Crécy. The victory enabled England to consolidate power in southwestern France and exert pressure on a weakened French crown, establishing patterns of negotiation, occupation, and military dominance that would shape subsequent campaigns. The battle underscored the interdependence of military outcomes and political authority, highlighting how battlefield success directly influenced governance and regional control during prolonged conflict. The capture of King John II at Poitiers left France in a state of profound political disarray. With the monarch held in English captivity, central authority effectively collapsed, exposing vulnerabilities in the feudal system that had long underpinned governance. The Dauphin Charles, the future Charles V, assumed responsibility for the administration of the kingdom, but his authority was contested across provinces where local governors and noble factions increasingly acted independently. Tax revenues plummeted as collectors struggled to enforce levies amid economic disruption, while competing aristocratic interests undermined coordinated military and fiscal responses. The Estates General, seizing the opportunity created by royal weakness, demanded reforms that constrained monarchical power, including oversight of taxation and royal expenditure. Traditional feudal bonds proved insufficient to maintain order or enforce obedience, revealing systemic weaknesses in a kingdom that relied heavily on personal loyalty and hierarchical discipline. The absence of a reigning monarch forced an unprecedented decentralization of authority, demonstrating how battlefield outcomes directly influenced political stability. France's inability to mobilize resources or unify leadership in the aftermath of Poitiers would influence every major policy decision in the subsequent years, illustrating the interdependence of military defeat and structural governance challenges. The resulting fragmentation set the stage for civil unrest and popular uprisings, as a society accustomed to hierarchical order struggled to adapt to leadership vacuums. The Jacquerie of 1358 emerged as a direct consequence of wartime devastation, economic pressure, and weakened aristocratic oversight. In the wake of Poitiers, bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside, pillaging villages and exacerbating the hardships of peasants burdened by taxation and compulsory labor. In the Beauvais region, peasants organized spontaneously to attack manor houses, seizing what resources they could and targeting local lords seen as complicit in their suffering. The uprising spread rapidly, revealing both pent-up resentment and the fragility of rural social structures. Coordination among the rebels was limited, and while they occasionally succeeded in overwhelming small garrisons, they lacked the organization and resources to sustain prolonged campaigns. Nobles, often aided by urban militias, ultimately suppressed the revolt with brutal force, restoring traditional authority but leaving a trail of destruction. The Jacquerie highlighted the vulnerability of peasant communities under extreme stress and illustrated how local grievances could escalate into violent challenges to the established social hierarchy. Although short-lived, the uprising underscored the societal pressures that wartime disruption imposed, demonstrating that military defeat at the national level could have profound consequences far from the battlefield. The revolt also revealed the interconnectedness of economic hardship, insecurity, and social tension during periods of prolonged conflict, foreshadowing challenges the monarchy would face in reasserting order. While rural areas erupted in rebellion, urban centers also confronted the monarchy, most prominently through the leadership of Étienne Marcel, provost of the merchants of Paris. Exploiting the political vacuum created by John II's captivity, Marcel sought to impose constitutional reforms, enhance oversight of royal finances, and limit noble privileges, advocating for a governance structure that included increased urban representation. He mobilized guilds, merchant leaders, and segments of the population to assert pressure on the Dauphin Charles, installing a Parisian militia to enforce compliance. The revolt reached a critical juncture when Marcel orchestrated the killing of 2 royal marshals in the Dauphin's presence, an act that alienated moderates and provoked counteraction by royalist forces. Marcel's movement highlighted competing visions of governance, one emphasizing centralized royal authority, the other seeking participatory mechanisms to check monarchical power. Ultimately, Marcel was assassinated, and Paris returned to royal control, but the episode left a lasting imprint on French political culture, revealing the fragility of authority, the rising influence of urban actors, and the potential for constitutional demands to emerge during periods of crisis. This urban unrest compounded rural instability, emphasizing the multifaceted nature of social and political challenges confronting France. The confrontation in Paris also demonstrated the limits of extra-legal power within medieval urban centers and the dangers inherent in challenging entrenched noble and monarchical hierarchies during wartime. The Treaty of Bretigny, signed in 1360, temporarily halted the major conflicts of the first phase of the Hundred Years' War, representing England's peak territorial expansion. Under its terms, Edward III gained full sovereignty over a vast swath of southwestern France, including Aquitaine enlarged to nearly 1/3 of the kingdom, removing the obligation of homage to the French crown. In exchange, Edward formally renounced his claim to the French throne, a concession that was more symbolic than enforceable in the long term. The treaty also established the framework for King John II's ransom, imposing a substantial financial burden on France that further strained its already weakened economy. Despite these provisions, Bretigny proved fragile. French resentment remained intense. Local administration of newly ceded territories faced logistical challenges, and sovereignty disputes persisted. The treaty reflected exhaustion and pragmatic compromise rather than genuine resolution, providing temporary respite from active warfare while leaving underlying causes of conflict intact. England consolidated territorial gains and strategic positions, but the unresolved political and economic tensions ensured that the cessation of hostilities would be temporary. Bretigny illustrates how negotiated settlements can offer immediate stability, yet fail to address the structural grievances and ambitions that precipitated war, setting the stage for renewed hostilities in the following decades. The Treaty of Bretigny provided a brief respite from open warfare, but proved fragile almost immediately. England acquired extensive territories, including Aquitaine, under conditions that required careful administration, while France faced the daunting task of raising King John II's massive ransom. The economic strain on France was severe. Taxation to fund the ransom exacerbated public discontent, and regional authorities often resisted centralized demands. Simultaneously, large bands of unemployed mercenaries, known as free companies, roamed the countryside, pillaging towns and undermining local governance. English administration in Aquitaine encountered resistance from local lords who remained culturally and politically attached to the French crown, complicating efforts to enforce full sovereignty. The treaty's redistribution of power unintentionally fostered new grievances, as both kingdoms struggled to reconcile political authority with economic capacity. Administrative inefficiencies, lingering animosities, and the presence of armed, restless mercenaries created conditions in which peace became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the early 1360s, both England and France recognized the temporary nature of Bretagne, understanding that unresolved territorial disputes, local resistance, and financial burdens made renewed conflict highly probable. The period revealed how treaties without enforceable mechanisms and shared political consensus often fail to stabilize long-term geopolitical rivalries, particularly in regions marked by divided loyalties and social tension. These challenges created the strategic opening for a new French leadership to consolidate power, restore administrative order, and plan a methodical resurgence against English holdings. Charles V ascended the French throne in 1364 amid a kingdom still reeling from defeat at Poitiers and the ongoing instability generated by Bretagne's terms. Known as Charles the Wise, he prioritized restoring central authority, strengthening fiscal institutions, and consolidating the monarchy's reach. He reformed the taxation system, enhanced royal accounting procedures, and curtailed the autonomy of powerful nobles who had exploited the previous vacuum of authority. Rather than seeking immediate battlefield glory, Charles adopted a strategy of measured, defensive engagement. Fortifications were reinforced, resources conserved, and campaigns carefully planned to minimize risk while gradually reclaiming territory. He relied on trusted advisors and capable military commanders, most notably Bertrand du Guesclin, to execute his policies, blending administrative competence with strategic foresight. Charles's emphasis on governance, economic stability, and long-term planning enabled France to recover institutional cohesion, rebuild public confidence, and re-establish the monarchy's credibility. His approach demonstrated that strategic patience, coupled with effective administration, could reverse the disadvantages imposed by earlier defeats. By laying the administrative and logistical foundation, Charles created conditions in which France could undertake a calculated counteroffensive, gradually undermining English gains and setting the stage for the resurgence that would define the next decade of the war. Bertrand du Guesclin, appointed Constable of France, became the central architect of France's military recovery during the late 1360s and early 1370s. Recognizing the risks of open battle against disciplined English forces equipped with longbows, du Guesclin employed a strategy of attrition and harassment. His forces systematically recaptured key towns and fortresses, avoided large-scale confrontations, and exploited England's overextended administration in Aquitaine and Normandy. Local resentment toward English taxation and legal impositions proved advantageous, as peasants and townspeople provided intelligence and logistical support to French forces. Du Guesclin's campaigns capitalized on maneuver, siegecraft, and disruption, gradually eroding English control without the high casualties associated with pitched battles. By mid-1370s, France had regained significant territories, demonstrating that unconventional approaches could yield strategic success even against numerically superior opponents. The general's emphasis on indirect methods highlighted the evolving nature of medieval warfare, where governance, local support, and calculated operational pressure could be as decisive as battlefield victory. Du Guesclin's efforts undermined English authority, strengthened French morale, and set the stage for sustained counteroffensives, transforming the strategic balance across contested regions and laying the groundwork for long-term territorial recovery. By the mid to late 1370s, England faced the cumulative effects of prolonged warfare, financial exhaustion, and administrative strain. Funding large-scale campaigns became increasingly difficult, as Parliament resisted heavy taxation and regional magnates disputed policy decisions. The Black Prince's declining health further weakened English leadership in Aquitaine, undermining governance and military coordination. Controversial policies, such as the hearth tax of 1368, provoked local resistance, reducing compliance and complicating revenue collection. Military forces were overstretched, defending widespread holdings against a resurgent France guided by du Guesclin's attritional strategy. Maritime control was also contested, with French and Castilian fleets disrupting English supply lines and limiting reinforcements. By 1380, England had lost much of the territory gained during earlier phases, signaling the erosion of the empire built in the 1340s and 1350s. The concurrent deaths of Charles V and Du Guesclin marked the end of a transformative period, leaving both kingdoms to confront a new set of political and military challenges. Financial fatigue, administrative mismanagement, and the inability to adapt to evolving French strategies revealed the limits of sustained territorial expansion and highlighted how internal pressures can decisively shape the trajectory of long-term conflicts. This contraction in English fortunes presaged the next phase of the war, characterized by renewed initiatives under different leadership and changing political priorities. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, represented a moment of profound crisis for the French monarchy. Under the terms of the agreement, Charles VI recognized Henry V of England as his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles. This arrangement effectively placed the crowns of England and France in line for personal union under Henry VI, a situation unprecedented in medieval European politics. The treaty reflected both France's military defeats, culminating in losses at Agincourt and surrounding campaigns, and the deep internal divisions between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. Paris and key northern territories came under Anglo-Burgundian control, leaving the Dauphin confined to the southern provinces. The agreement posed severe questions about legitimacy, succession, and governance, as royal continuity was central to taxation, military command, and diplomacy. By delegitimizing the Dauphin, the treaty risked fracturing loyalty among nobles and urban populations. While intended to secure peace and consolidate English authority, the Treaty of Troyes instead intensified resistance and sowed the conditions for a revival of French opposition, particularly in the Loire Valley, where the Dauphin retained influence and resources to challenge Anglo-Burgundian dominance. Following the Treaty of Troyes and Henry V's early victories, England reached the zenith of its continental power through its alliance with Burgundy. The Anglo-Burgundian coalition allowed England to exercise political control over northern France, administer key cities, maintain garrisons, and secure trade routes critical to funding continued operations. The Burgundians, motivated by dynastic interests after John the Fearless assassination, pursued a strategy that weakened the Dauphinist faction and reinforced English territorial claims. English administration implemented taxation systems, established local councils, and co-opted French officials willing to collaborate, creating an ostensibly functional governance network. Yet beneath apparent stability, inherent weaknesses persisted, divergent priorities, regional identities, and the logistical difficulty of sustaining garrisons across a fractured kingdom posed persistent risks. The Anglo-Burgundian dominance, while impressive in the short term, relied on a fragile balance of mutual interest and coercion, leaving the alliance vulnerable to shifts in loyalty, local resistance, and the resurgence of the Dauphinist court. This period highlights the paradox of medieval alliances, where temporary success could mask long-term structural fragilities. Confined to Bourges and a limited southern territory, the Dauphin Charles maintained a court that functioned as the administrative and symbolic center of resistance. Labeled by English propaganda as the King of Bourges, he controlled only a fraction of France, but leveraged his position to maintain institutional continuity, diplomatic outreach, and cultural patronage. Key figures, such as Yolande of Aragon, played crucial roles in sustaining morale, guiding policy, and fostering alliances. The court managed taxation within its domains, gradually rebuilt military capabilities, and articulated a moral and ideological claim to legitimacy grounded in hereditary succession and divine sanction. Despite constrained resources, the Dauphinist administration successfully projected authority, cultivated loyalty among regional elites, and laid the groundwork for strategic resurgence. Bourges became both a practical center of governance and a symbolic bastion of legitimate monarchy, demonstrating how a kingdom in exile could preserve institutional coherence and prepare the foundation for a broader revival, even amid military and political adversity. During the early 1420s, military operations in central France were characterized by attrition and territorial stalemate. England controlled major northern cities, but the logistical and financial demands of subduing southern regions limited operational reach. The Loire Valley, including strategic centers such as Orleans, became the contested pivot of the conflict. Both Dauphinist and English forces invested heavily in controlling river crossings, supply lines, and fortified towns, as dominance in this corridor would determine access to the southern provinces. Local militias, emerging military captains, and shifting allegiances influenced the conduct of operations, while the increasing use of artillery began to shape siege and field engagements. The protracted struggle created conditions for decisive intervention, as the balance of power rested on the ability of the Dauphinist faction to maintain cohesion and exploit English overextension. Control of the Loire emerged as both a military and psychological imperative, setting the stage for the arrival of a figure whose leadership would transform morale, galvanize resistance, and redefine the trajectory of the war, Joan of Arc. By early 1429, France was a nation fractured by decades of military setbacks and internal division. The Dauphin Charles controlled only a diminished portion of southern territories, while the north, including Paris, remained under Anglo-Burgundian occupation. Orleans, strategically positioned on the Loire River, faced imminent capitulation after months of English siege, signaling the potential collapse of organized resistance. In this context, Joan of Arc emerged as an unlikely yet pivotal figure. Born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village in northeastern France, she was raised in a peasant household steeped in religious observance and rural community life. Reports of divine visions and voices instructed her to support the Dauphin and deliver France from English domination. Initially met with skepticism, Joan petitioned local authorities at Vaucouleurs, who, recognizing both her determination and the extraordinary political circumstances, escorted her to the Dauphin's court. Her emergence reflects more than personal conviction. It was intertwined with France's desperate need for a unifying symbol, a society predisposed to interpret spiritual phenomena as political signs, and the Dauphin's precarious authority, which allowed an unconventional messenger to gain consideration. The convergence of these factors explains why a young peasant girl could attract the attention of political leaders at such a critical juncture. Upon her arrival at Chinon, Joan underwent a rigorous process of evaluation before receiving official sanction to participate in military operations. Advisors to the Dauphin, cautious of charlatanry or manipulation, arranged for an ecclesiastical examination at Poitiers. Clergy questioned her extensively on theological matters, assessed her orthodoxy, and evaluated the consistency of her claims. Her comportment, conviction, and clear understanding of religious doctrine impressed evaluators, while the political utility of endorsing her claims added practical weight to their decision. The court outfitted her with armor, placed her under the guidance of experienced captains, and allowed her to carry a banner that would become a visible emblem of Dauphinist morale. Joan's presence served both symbolic and operational purposes. She embodied divine legitimacy, revitalized troop confidence, and helped rally previously hesitant nobles and soldiers. Her approval was therefore not merely a recognition of spiritual authenticity, but a strategic calculation, demonstrating the fusion of religious belief and political necessity in medieval governance. The endorsement of Joan transformed her from an extraordinary curiosity into a sanctioned participant capable of shaping battlefield outcomes. The Siege of Orleans in early 1429 represented a critical juncture for the Dauphinist cause. English forces, positioned on multiple fortified outposts around the city, had imposed severe constraints on supplies and morale, threatening imminent surrender. Joan's arrival reinvigorated defenders and commanders, though she did not replace the strategic role of seasoned captains. Over several weeks, coordinated attacks on English fortifications, supported by French militia and the Dauphinist army, gradually loosened the siege. Joan's visibility, courage, and symbolic presence played a decisive psychological role, reinforcing morale and encouraging decisive action by military leaders. Her participation altered the perception of invincibility that the English had enjoyed, producing a sudden shift in momentum. On May 8, 1429, the lifting of the siege marked a dual victory. It restored strategic control of a key Loire city and demonstrated that the French forces could challenge English dominance. The success at Orleans underscored the importance of morale, symbolism, and public perception in addition to conventional tactics, reshaping the operational and psychological landscape of the conflict. Following Orleans, the Dauphinist forces, guided by Joan's advocacy and renewed confidence, initiated a sequence of rapid offensives along the Loire Valley, capturing Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. These victories demonstrated the growing cohesion and strategic coordination of French forces, with Joan continuing to inspire morale and encourage disciplined engagement. Commanders such as Jean d'Alençon and La Hire effectively implemented tactical maneuvers that complemented her symbolic presence. Attention then turned to Reims, the traditional site of coronations for French kings. Joan insisted that the Dauphin proceed, emphasizing the necessity of formal coronation to consolidate legitimacy and counter the claims advanced by the Treaty of Troyes. Despite logistical risks and contested territory, the Dauphin advanced, culminating in the coronation of Charles VII on July 17, 1429. This act solidified dynastic continuity, strengthened institutional authority, and provided a rallying point for future military campaigns. The Loire campaign and Reims coronation transformed French strategy from defensive survival to an assertive posture, establishing momentum and moral authority that would sustain the subsequent phase of the war. In 1430, Joan of Arc's meteoric rise came to a dramatic halt when she was captured near Compiègne by Burgundian forces during a skirmish. Her removal deprived the French cause of a figure who had embodied morale, divine legitimacy, and the symbolic unity of the Dauphinist movement. The Burgundians handed Joan over to the English, who quickly orchestrated a highly politicized trial in Rouen. The proceedings were designed less to assess theological truth than to undermine her influence and, by extension, the authority of Charles VII. Presided over by pro-English clergy, the trial sought to frame Joan's visions as heretical and her actions as unlawful, portraying her as a manipulative agent rather than a divinely inspired leader. Despite her steadfastness and eloquence in defending her mission, Joan was convicted and executed by burning at the stake in May 1431. The English intended this act to demoralize the French and delegitimize the Dauphin's rule, yet Joan's death had the opposite effect. She became a martyr, an enduring symbol of resistance. Rather than extinguishing the movement she led, her execution intensified anti-English sentiment, reinforcing the idea that France's struggle was sanctioned by divine providence. This episode highlights the paradoxical consequences of targeting symbolic leadership. England removed a figurehead but strengthened the underlying cause she represented. Following Joan's death, Charles VII moved to consolidate and professionalize France's war effort. Recognizing the inefficiencies of traditional feudal levies and the unreliability of some nobles, he established permanent military companies, often considered the foundation of France's first standing army. These units provided a stable, disciplined force capable of sustained operations independent of ad hoc feudal contributions. Alongside military reforms, Charles introduced fiscal measures such as the taille, creating predictable revenue streams to fund campaigns and reduce dependency on irregular levies. He also pursued institutional reforms, most notably the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, 1438, which curtailed papal authority over ecclesiastical appointments and strengthened royal control of the church within France. These administrative changes enhanced cohesion, streamlined command, and improved resource mobilization, enabling France to plan campaigns strategically rather than reactively. By combining organizational, fiscal, and military reforms, Charles transformed the previously fragmented kingdom into a more centralized state capable of sustained, coordinated resistance and systematic reconquest. England's continental position weakened further as its alliance with Burgundy unraveled. Initially forged in response to John the Fearless murder in 1419, the Anglo-Burgundian partnership had provided manpower, political legitimacy, and regional influence. By the 1430s, however, shifting priorities and dissatisfaction with English governance eroded that alliance. Charles VII skillfully pursued diplomacy, leveraging key intermediaries like Arthur de Richemont to reconcile with Burgundy. Economic interdependence, combined with Burgundy's desire to secure long-term interests, culminated in the Treaty of Arras in 1435, formally re-establishing Burgundian loyalty to the French crown. The loss of Burgundian support deprived England of essential troops, funding, and strategic depth, isolating their garrisons in northern France. The dissolution of this alliance not only weakened English military capacity, but also eroded their political credibility, leaving previously secure positions increasingly vulnerable to concerted French offensives. With strengthened governance, improved armies, and the defection of Burgundy, France launched a systematic reconquest. In 1436, French forces recaptured Paris, reversing a decade of English occupation and restoring the symbolic heart of the kingdom. Over the 1440s, Charles VII's forces conducted coordinated campaigns into Normandy, employing combined arms tactics that integrated artillery, infantry, and cavalry effectively. The decisive victory at the Battle of Formigny in 1450 marked the end of English power in Normandy, demonstrating the operational sophistication of the reformed French army. English losses were compounded by domestic challenges, political instability, financial strain, and declining public support for war made sustaining continental holdings increasingly untenable. By contrast, France had become a more cohesive, strategically adept, and administratively centralized state. The collapse of English authority in Normandy set the stage for the final phase of the Hundred Years' War, as France prepared to reclaim its remaining territories in the southwest, culminating the long process of reconquest and national restoration. By the mid-15th century, Gascony represented the final stronghold of English power in France, a region whose economic and symbolic significance made it the focal point of the war's concluding phase. Under English rule for centuries, Gascony's economy had become deeply intertwined with England, particularly through the lucrative wine trade that financed royal coffers and supported English domestic ambitions. Local elites, accustomed to English administration and the privileges it conferred, maintained a cautious loyalty that was as pragmatic as it was cultural. However, the broader context of the 1450s revealed vulnerabilities. France had rebuilt its military capacity, strengthened administrative control, and demonstrated the ability to project power into previously contested territories. England, in contrast, faced financial constraints, political instability, and difficulties mounting large-scale expeditions across the Channel. Strategically, Gascony was not merely a province. It represented the last vestige of Plantagenet imperial presence on the continent. Its defense required maintaining garrisons, supply lines, and alliances with local nobility, all under conditions of increasing French pressure. Consequently, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation. The fate of Gascony would determine whether England retained any meaningful foothold in France or whether the continental phase of the Hundred Years' War would finally conclude. The final English attempt to retain Gascony culminated in the Battle of Castillon on July 17, 1453, a clash often described as heralding the advent of modern warfare. French forces, led by Jean Bureau, had entrenched themselves with formidable artillery positions and prepared for a disciplined defensive engagement. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, commanding the English counteroffensive, misinterpreted French movements as a retreat and launched a premature assault. The result was catastrophic. Concentrated artillery fire decimated advancing troops, and Talbot himself was killed, signaling not only a military defeat, but a symbolic end to the era of traditional English battlefield leadership in France. Castillon illustrated the transformative effect of field artillery, coordinated infantry, and fortified positions, demonstrating that emerging technology could decisively shape engagements. This battle marked a shift in military doctrine, showing how systematic preparation and firepower could overcome the tactical boldness that had previously defined medieval campaigns. The French victory at Castillon effectively sealed English defeat in the southwest, leaving Bordeaux and the remaining Gascon territories exposed. Following Castillon, the collapse of English control in Gascony was rapid and inevitable. Bordeaux, the administrative and commercial center of the region, could not withstand sustained French pressure without reinforcements or reliable support from England, which was itself politically fragmented. By October 1453, the city surrendered, ending nearly 3 centuries of English presence in southwestern France. Local elites and merchants, previously inclined to cooperate with English authorities, accepted the new political reality, allowing French administration to re-establish governance, restore fiscal mechanisms, and integrate Gascony fully into the royal domain. The fall of Bordeaux was more than a military setback. It represented the conclusion of England's continental ambitions and the affirmation of French territorial sovereignty. Strategically, the capture of Gascony removed the final obstacle to a fully unified France under Charles VII, consolidating military, administrative, and symbolic authority in the hands of the monarchy. While the Hundred Years' War lacked a formal peace treaty, the sequence of events culminating in Castillon and the fall of Bordeaux marked its practical conclusion. England, weakened by domestic strife and on the verge of the Wars of the Roses, could not sustain continental campaigns. France, strengthened by Charles VII's reforms, experienced territorial reunification and administrative consolidation. Wartime institutions transitioned to peacetime functions, including refined taxation, centralized governance, and integrated military structures. Politically, the conflict reshaped both kingdoms. France emerged with a stronger monarchy capable of projecting authority across its territories, while England entered a period of internal fragmentation that would delay any resurgence of continental ambitions. The end of the war demonstrates that protracted conflicts in the medieval period often concluded not through formal treaties, but through decisive shifts in military capacity, political cohesion, and strategic advantage. France's complete reclamation of its core territories in 1453 closed the chapter on a century-long struggle, establishing conditions for national consolidation, territorial stability, and a new era of monarchical authority. By the end of the Hundred Years' War, France had transformed from a fragmented collection of semi-autonomous territories into a more centralized monarchy. In 1337, the kingdom's political landscape was defined by powerful duchies and counties whose loyalties were often negotiable, leaving the crown dependent on noble cooperation for defense, taxation, and administration. Decades of protracted conflict forced the monarchy to innovate structurally. Charles VII's reforms, most notably the establishment of permanent standing armies, a more reliable taxation system, and tighter oversight of the church, shifted authority from regional lords to the crown. Administrative improvements, including standardized record-keeping and provincial governance, ensured that royal directives could be enforced even in previously semi-independent areas. The elimination of major English enclaves, alongside the reassertion of central control over military and fiscal mechanisms, compelled nobles to rely on the king for protection and governance, thereby reinforcing monarchical supremacy. These developments laid the institutional groundwork that subsequent monarchs, such as Louis XI, would expand, gradually producing the foundations of a more modern state. The war's pressures thus inadvertently strengthened royal authority, reshaping France's political geography, clarifying borders, and fostering a sense of centralized governance that would endure well into the early modern period. England's defeat in France triggered a profound internal crisis that culminated in the Wars of the Roses. Unlike France, which emerged more cohesive, England faced political fragmentation exacerbated by the financial strains of prolonged conflict and the collapse of opportunities for territorial advancement abroad. The loss of continental holdings undermined the legitimacy of Henry VI, whose weak rule and recurring mental health issues created a power vacuum at court. Competing factions, primarily the Lancastrians and Yorkists, vied for dominance, turning political rivalry into open warfare by the mid-1450s. Military elites previously engaged in continental campaigns redirected their ambitions inward, intensifying factional disputes. England's withdrawal from France forced the kingdom to confront the destabilizing consequences of military failure, revealing how the loss of external territories could reverberate through domestic politics. In this context, the Hundred Years' War became not merely a foreign conflict, but a catalyst for dynastic struggle, reshaping the English monarchy and precipitating decades of civil war. The Hundred Years' War accelerated profound economic, social, and military transformations across Western Europe. Economically, sustained warfare disrupted trade and agricultural production, but also spurred innovations in taxation, financial administration, and logistical management. France's post-war recovery required rebuilding markets, re-establishing revenue streams, and reintegrating war-torn regions into a coherent economic framework. Socially, the combined effects of the Black Death and wartime devastation encouraged labor mobility, weakened feudal obligations, and reduced reliance on large noble retinues. Militarily, the conflict demonstrated the growing importance of disciplined infantry, artillery, and centralized command structures, signaling a shift away from medieval patterns of combat toward methods characteristic of early modern warfare. The adoption of permanent armies, professional soldiers, and coordinated artillery units reflected a broader transformation in military organization, linking technological innovation with administrative efficiency. Collectively, these shifts illustrate how the Hundred Years' War served as a bridge between medieval and early modern Europe, shaping the structures, strategies, and social norms that would define the late 15th and 16th centuries. Beyond political and military transformations, the Hundred Years' War profoundly shaped cultural memory and emerging national identities. In France, the conflict reinforced the centrality of the monarchy, territorial unity, and the symbolic power of figures such as Joan of Arc, who became an enduring emblem of resilience, divine favor, and national restoration. In England, the loss of continental territories complicated the narrative of national identity, but stories of chivalric valor, military campaigns, and the exploits of Edward III and Henry V continued to shape historical memory. Chroniclers, literary works, and later historians transformed the war into a story of heroism, rivalry, and dynastic ambition, embedding it into the cultural consciousness of both nations. The Hundred Years' War thus became more than a military episode. It functioned as a formative experience in the construction of political legitimacy, cultural narratives, and collective identity. Its memory informed later understandings of nationhood, governance, and historical continuity, demonstrating how a prolonged conflict can leave an enduring imprint on societal self-perception.